At 5:32 p.m. on January 31, 2026, Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, cognitively sharp, physically limited, but fully present, settles into the back seat of a rideshare vehicle in the Catalina foothills, just north of Tucson, Arizona. She is calm. No visible distress. No scanning behavior. No sign that anything is wrong. Her baseline appears exactly what you would expect from a woman who has lived independently in the same community for more than 50 years. She is moving through an ordinary evening, unaware that, if investigators are right, that ordinary routine may already have been studied, timed, and turned into a vulnerability. The rideshare drops her at the home of her daughter, Annie. She has dinner. She laughs. She is engaged. At approximately 9:50 p.m., her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drives her home. He watches her go inside. He leaves. And from that point forward, Nancy Guthrie steps into a corridor of time that no one has yet been able to fully reconstruct. Pause. That quiet ride in the car may be the last moment in which her night is still normal. What follows does not look random. It does not read like noise, panic, or chance. It reads, at least from the timeline investigators have assembled, like a sequence, deliberate, phased, and executed inside a window someone may have prepared for in advance. So map it not through emotion, but through structure. Through timestamps. Through surveillance gaps. Through the digital residue a life leaves behind. At 9:50 p.m., Nancy Guthrie is home. The door closes. And then the known timeline begins to thin. The next several hours are not empty because nothing happened. They are empty because whatever happened may have unfolded inside exactly the kind of blind spot investigators fear most, the stretch of night where routine, isolation, and limited recording overlap. Then the first fracture. 1:47 a.m. Her Nest doorbell camera disconnects. That detail matters. A disconnect, by itself, can be innocent. Devices fail. Connections drop. Systems go offline. But in a forensic timeline, isolated glitches are less important than how they align with everything around them. And here, the disconnect does not sit alone. It sits inside a sequence that investigators believe may indicate intentional interference. Then another marker. 2:12 a.m. One of her home cameras detects a presence. Motion is registered. But no recording exists, because the device was not linked to a cloud subscription. The system detected activity. It logged that activity. And then the visual record ends there. That is a critical distinction. Because if someone entered that environment knowing which devices actively recorded and which only detected motion, that would suggest more than opportunism. It would suggest familiarity with the space, or prior effort to understand its weaknesses. Not luck. Not improvisation. But environmental probing, the kind of pre-operational observation used to reduce uncertainty before a high-risk act. Then comes the last digital tether. 2:28 a.m. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stops syncing with her iPhone. The app registers the disconnect. And then it goes silent. By 2:28 a.m., the remaining digital threads tying Nancy Guthrie to the life she had been living appear to go dark. Doorbell disconnected. Motion detected without footage. Pacemaker sync lost. 3 separate signals. 1 narrowing window. That combination does not, on its own, explain what happened. But it does suggest a transition point, the moment at which normal life gives way to enforced absence. And that is where the case shifts from disappearance to architecture. Because investigators have focused not only on the night Nancy vanished, but on the days leading up to it. 3 dates matter: January 11th, January 23rd, January 31st. The first 2 are not dates of crisis. They are dates investigators believe may reflect reconnaissance. On January 11th, and again on January 23rd, surveillance cameras from neighboring properties in the Catalina foothills reportedly captured footage that may show suspicious activity near Nancy Guthrie's home. If that interpretation is correct, then the night of January 31st was not the beginning of the operation. It was the final phase. The earlier dates may represent what behavioral analysts often describe as uncertainty reduction, identifying patterns, removing variables, refining timing. When does she return home? When is she alone? When does the neighborhood quiet down? What is visible from the street? Where is the camera mounted? What records, and what only detects? That is not the logic of impulse. That is the logic of preparation. The doorbell camera footage later released publicly by FBI Director Kash Patel appears to reinforce that possibility. In the footage, a masked individual, gloved, armed, carrying a 25-liter black Ozark Trail backpack sold at Walmart, is seen attempting to knock the doorbell camera loose. When that fails, he covers the lens with foliage from a potted plant on the porch. That detail is small, but operationally, it is revealing. He appears to know the camera is there. He appears to have a plan to disable or obstruct it. And when the first method fails, he moves immediately to a backup. That is not what panic looks like. That looks like contingency. Which raises the central question of this case: how much of that environment had already been studied before that night began? Because abducting a living person, particularly an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility, from a residential neighborhood in the early hours of the morning is not a simple act. It requires timing. It requires control. And it almost certainly requires an exit strategy. You do not remove someone from a home, move them through a neighborhood, and disappear without thinking about corridor logic in advance. Where are the cameras? Which streets are darkest? Which route minimizes exposure? How long from entry to exit? How long before detection? Investigators and residents later identified Ring camera footage from possible egress routes in and around the Catalina foothills between midnight and 6 a.m. on February 1st. Some of that vehicle activity reportedly clusters around the 2:30 a.m. window, almost exactly where the pacemaker's final sync ends at 2:28 a.m. That timing may matter. Because if 2:28 a.m. marks the last known digital connection to Nancy Guthrie, then the minutes immediately after may represent the operational exit window. Tight. Controlled. Potentially rehearsed. Then there is the glove. Roughly 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators recovered a single black glove believed to be consistent with the gloves worn by the suspect seen in the doorbell footage. The FBI submitted the glove for DNA testing. A profile was obtained. And, according to investigators, that profile matched no one in the national database. That finding cuts in two directions. First, it suggests the operator was not forensically invisible. Something was left behind. Second, it suggests that whatever trace was left may belong to someone with no prior entry in the system, no arrest history, no qualifying criminal sample, no immediate database hit. If so, investigators may be dealing either with a first-time offender, a highly disciplined offender, or someone operating well outside conventional criminal patterns. The vehicle used that night remains unidentified. And in a case like this, that may be one of the most important missing pieces. Because a vehicle is not just transportation. It is a moving containment space. It is where fibers transfer, where blood travels, where decisions get made after extraction, where the operation either stays controlled or begins to come apart. If that vehicle is ever located, it may become the single most consequential forensic development in the case. Months into the investigation, the picture remains incomplete, but the convergence is difficult to ignore. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department have both been involved, though not without reported friction. FBI Director Kash Patel stated publicly that the Bureau was not brought into the case for 4 days after Nancy's disappearance, calling the earliest hours of an abduction the most critical. The Sheriff's Department disputed that characterization. Whatever the disagreement, the larger point remains: time matters in a case like this. And by the time the national machinery was fully engaged, the most valuable early window may already have narrowed. Still, the forensic effort continued to build. A private laboratory in Florida submitted DNA material, including a hair recovered at the scene, to the FBI for national database analysis. The recovered doorbell footage, obtained through cooperation between the FBI and Google despite the absence of a cloud subscription, yielded images the Bureau later enhanced, measured, and released to the public. The suspect is estimated to be approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches, average build, with a black mustache. His visible clothing and gear, mask, gloves, backpack, were assessed by investigators as items likely purchased from Walmart. Authorities have reportedly reviewed regional Walmart purchase records for Ozark Trail backpacks across multiple months. In the days after Nancy disappeared, multiple ransom notes surfaced demanding cryptocurrency. 2 deadlines passed. Their true origin remains unclear, which means investigators are not only confronting the physical disappearance of a person, but also the possibility of post-event manipulation, noise injected into the case to distort motive, timeline, or authorship. And that brings us to the most unsettling part of the entire record. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance may not have begun when the camera disconnected. It may not have begun when motion was detected. It may not even have begun when the pacemaker stopped syncing. It may have begun weeks earlier, when someone first noticed her, first watched her, first converted her routine into a target profile. That is the deeper violence embedded in this case. Not just the taking, but the planning, the observation, the quiet extraction of predictability from an ordinary life. Routine feels like safety because it is familiar. But in the hands of a patient, methodical offender, routine becomes data. It reveals when you are alone, when help is farthest away, when the street is quiet, when the camera sees, and when it does not. Nancy Guthrie was not vulnerable because her life was chaotic. She may have been vulnerable because her life was stable, because she was independent, because she was known, because she came home the way she always came home. And if that is true, then the most disturbing fact in this case is also the simplest. Her disappearance did not start with a struggle. It started with surveillance. She walked inside. She closed the door. She followed her routine. And somewhere before that night was over, someone else appears to have used that routine against her. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. The investigation remains active. If you have information, contact the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Department through 88 Crime. This is the case code. We stay with the evidence until the evidence speaks.